Welcome everyone to another performance clinic. Today's topic is network and infrastructure performance monitoring of your hybrid cloud. My name is Andy Grabner, and with me today is Mike Kerneman, Senior Systems Engineer at Dynatrace. Hi Mike, how are you doing?
I am doing just fine, Andy. How are you doing?
Very well, very well. And again, thank you so much for joining us today. I know you have a lot of content prepared. That's why I want to give it right over to you. The topic today is very important. I can see this by the number of people that are attending, also the questions we received typically when we talk about these topics. You also have given a hands-on training day at Perform in Vegas earlier this year, which is also why I asked you to share some of that content in a condensed version as part of this performance clinic. So, Mike, without further ado, the stage is yours. And if questions come in, I will throw them over at you at the right time, okay?
All right. Thank you very much, Andy. So let's go ahead and get started. Let's talk about what we're going to cover during this. We're going to go over some of the network and infrastructure monitoring concepts at a high level. This is not quite the same as application monitoring and service level monitoring. There are a few different use cases that you really need to concentrate and focus on when it comes to network and infrastructure monitoring. We're going to talk about what some of the Dynatrace capabilities are in this arena, because we do cover this quite well. This is a core functionality that the product has, but a lot of it may get drowned out because there's so much focus on the applications and services, but we really are strong in this area of the network and infrastructure. So we're going to actually demo some of the capabilities from a OneAgent standpoint, what OneAgent provides where infrastructure is concerned. We'll talk a bit about ActiveGate and the ActiveGate extensions, which are a means of getting data and metrics and availability from systems that you may not be able to install OneAgents on. Synthetics are an important part of network and infrastructure monitoring, and Dynatrace does that very well, and it's very important that you cover the network and the infrastructure support with some level of synthetics. You may not know that you're doing it, but it is there. The other typical question when you're talking about network monitoring and infrastructure monitoring, but network monitoring in particular, is, well, what about the packets? And why aren't you using packets at this point? And we will definitely address that question as well. We're going to go into a bit of a demo around availability and how synthetics do play a role in the infrastructure monitoring, and then do a little bit of a deeper discussion about the extensions and the role they'll play. And we'll wrap it all up with a few tips and best practices within this specific arena. So some of the concepts when we're talking about network and infrastructure monitoring, as I mentioned, Dynatrace does this really well with how it's done. We focus on the full stack typically, which covers not only the application and service level detail, but it's also covering all of the infrastructure level detail, the host level detail for your hybrid cloud environments that are out there. As you can see in the green there, whenever you install our OneAgent in full stack mode, it's going to give you detailed information at not only that service level view in the blue, but the green levels that are identified, the lower levels on there, are what are provided with the host and process level monitoring that you get with infrastructure mode. For some of those application stacks where we do not support deep code level injection, so things like SAP ABAP servers, we would still install in infrastructure only mode so that you get those detailed host and process level metrics, and then potentially supplement that with our digital experience monitoring to provide the client level of visibility at the same time, so that you're able to fill in the gaps in terms of how your applications are working out there. So when we talk about some of the particular concepts around network and infrastructure monitoring, it's really typically based on what is your data collection method that's out there. When you think about the classical infrastructure monitoring, you're going to have your active types. That's going to be things like your ping checks, your SNMP polls, your WMI polls, host agents that are installed out there, synthetic checks. But then you're also going to have the passive modes. That's going to be the things like the trap processing, logging, and packet collection and flow analysis, flow metrics. Those are a lot of the classical methods that have been used when you think about network and infrastructure monitoring. And as we move into a lot of different environments out there, we're seeing a lot of these legacy solutions. And some of these included older Dynatrace solutions that would do some of these functionality as well. But these are being used, and the problem is that utilizing these as your primary monitoring source is really difficult because you do not get that service level view. And more importantly, as people are moving into these hybrid cloud environments, it's really tough to keep up with the dynamic nature of those environments. But what it turns out is some of these are still important, and that's why we're here today to talk about how some of these will still be utilized in the future. The other thing is, when looking at each of those various types of data collection methods and those tests that are going to be occurring out there, they typically cover a specific high-level use case when it comes to infrastructure monitoring. First and foremost is availability. Any type of infrastructure monitoring has to address availability first and foremost, because are the systems up? Are they available from any general locations or from, in particular, specific locations out there? Because if your systems are not available, your services are not available, your applications are not running, your customers are not happy. So infrastructure monitoring definitely has to cover availability. But we need to also take it a little bit further. Fault monitoring. Is there something going on that system that either could eventually or is presently impacting its ability to be able to service users, to be able to service those applications, to be able to transport data on there? That can be a straight hardware fault. It could be that a power supply has failed on there. It could be that a CPU is running hot on there and it's causing everything to go haywire, or it could be software oriented. It could be bad code got pushed out there, or it could be user error. It could be a configuration problem that's causing issues out there. Either way, fault monitoring is important when it comes to problem and alerting within the system. And then the last piece is performance. Originally, I had this just classified as a general bucket of performance, but there's really two specific use cases under performance. The one that we typically talk about is performance from a troubleshooting standpoint. So are the systems responding to user or system input in a timely manner out there? And is that changing over time as you increase or decrease load on the system? So that's where you need to be able to take some of this data and be able to help with determining if it's an infrastructure related issue that is causing problems within your applications and your services out there. But the other piece from an infrastructure monitoring standpoint is capacity planning. That's becoming much more important as people are starting to migrate into their hybrid cloud environments, because you need to find out, are there over provisioned resources in your environment out there, or are there systems out there that are overutilizing resources or soon will be in the near future that you need to plan for. So these are all typical use cases that infrastructure monitoring, whenever you're going to address it, needs to cover. This is what your teams are going to be expecting to deliver from any solution that's going to be doing some sort of network and infrastructure monitoring. So if we look at how some of those different tests fit into the different use cases of availability, fault, and performance, when we look at things like basic ping tests out there, it's great for availability, but it's not going to tell you anything really about fault, and it's minimal from performance. SNMP data, that's going to be great for availability, but it's not going to do much in the way of fault and performance data. Some on there, but again, it's somewhat limited. Same with WMI. It's essentially going to be giving you that great availability and some decent fault and performance type of availability. Host agents, which include obviously OneAgent. That's going to be great for availability, it's great for fault, and it's great for performance. That's something you definitely want to use wherever possible within the environment. Synthetic checks, again, availability, that's a great way to do it. That's a typical way to do it. Fault, it's not going to tell you anything really about fault because, again, it's just a synthetic check that's external to the systems that you're looking at out there, and it may give you some performance, basic performance information, so it can be good for that. SNMP trap processing, that's not going to do anything from an availability standpoint because there won't be any traps being sent out if there's not a problem going on within the system. So you don't know whether it's available or not. But fault, that's a definite area that trap processing can help with. If there's an event going on infrastructure out there, traps are going to tell you that something is going on and give you some details about it that are going to help with supporting that environment. Performance, it's really not going to give you a lot of good information from that standpoint. It's really fault oriented. Logging, again, availability, it's you can say logs aren't coming in. Does that mean that the system is not available? Maybe, maybe not. So it's not really a good judge of that. But fault and somewhat performance issues are going to be good from an analysis standpoint for logging. Packet analysis is generally good for all of those, as is flow analysis within the system. The other piece, though, that we typically talk about in modern days is API data. That's an additional data source that really provides a rich amount of metrics in your system. And most modern infrastructure will typically have some sort of API, whether it is a natural REST API, whether it is a proprietary one where you have to log in through a portal and execute a script, or maybe it's going to export its data through a specific job, but there's generally some form of API data available in most modern infrastructure. And that includes both your classic appliances and your classic single infrastructure system, but that can also cover things like your cloud infrastructure, your hybrid cloud infrastructure. So things like AWS CloudWatch and Azure Monitor and OpenShift with Prometheus data. There's a lot of different sources to provide information about how your cloud infrastructure is performing as well through various APIs that are out there. The other piece from a Dynatrace standpoint that we're going to be talking about is the concept of our plugins through our extensions. We have plugins that can run both on our OneAgent, but we're also going to be focusing primarily on what we call an ActiveGate plugin as a source of data on here. This definitely gives you good information about availability because it is pulling data typically through APIs, but can also pull through SNMP of different systems out there, and will give you fault and performance information. And this is one of the typical methods that we use right now and will be continuing to use in the future to extract data from systems that you cannot install your OneAgents on. So when we look at what does Dynatrace do very well when it comes to these types of systems out there, well, obviously host agents we do very well. Logging is something that we are strong and improving constantly on within the system. API data, we are definitely able to bring that in. The plugins, as I mentioned, that's a very specific area that we focus on. Synthetic checks is built into the product. We're going to be talking about that in one of our demos and showing how that works. WMI data is one of our plugin extensions that we have available to be able to extract additional data from some of those Windows servers out there. But things like ping, no, that's not something we're going to be doing at this point. Packet analysis and flow analysis, that is something that Dynatrace did in the past, but again, we'll be talking about why that is no longer really a viable option for the use cases that we have out there. And then when it comes to SNMP data and SNMP trap processing, we're going to focus a little bit on that at the end because that really is still an important concept when it comes to infrastructure monitoring. SNMP has been around for decades and it's not going anywhere. It's still a very viable method of getting metric and performance and fault data out of your various systems that are out there, and everybody needs to work with that. Dynatrace we'll talk about, and we will also talk about what is going to be our future capability in there, and that's one of the reasons we have Matthias on here. So before we jump into a little further, I want to just stop there and see, Andy, if we have any questions that have come up at this point, or...
Yeah, there's just, first of all, a couple of comments on the previous slide, which were, first of all, well received on a great overview of all of this. And it seems it also falls nicely into what today when you read up in the news, what's happening around service level indicators, service level objectives, everything that Google is kind of also defining under their SRE best practices, these different categories of availability, fault, performance. I think you did a great job. Some people were commenting, great job in giving this overview. So I want to forward that to you. The second thing, though, there's a question on ping. Isn't ping also something we can do through a Dynatrace plugin, where we can ping servers, where we can ping particular services, either through synthetic or through, I think there's some custom plugins out there that have a ping capability, unless we understand ping wrong here.
No, it is with the Dynatrace extensions. There's pretty much anything you can do from a command line script. We can do it. Mm-hmm. So ping is one, I believe, has actually been written out there that was deployed at one time. But the reason that I mark this as an X on there is because it's really been supplemented. The synthetic checks, which include things like port checks, are far better for availability than pings, because too often in the past, and I spent many years as a tools architect for a large company before I started on the vendor side with Dynatrace. Ping checks can present false positives too easily. Mm-hmm. Systems will respond to pings when they are not available out there. That's all too often going to occur. So that is your last resort. And that's why a lot of very basic and freeware tools will do ping checks on the system. Mm-hmm. The other thing is that from a security standpoint, there are a lot of internal security teams that don't like to see ICMP traffic flying all over the place. And so they may block it at the firewall in various DMZs. So that makes it more difficult to use that as a consistent availability check across a large ecosystem. So if we look at the synthetic checks, and what I'll specifically be talking about there are port checks, there's always going to be specific ports open through those DMZs, through those systems out there. And if you get responses on those ports, that's telling you at a much higher level that the system is likely available versus a ping check.
Perfect. Thanks for the answer and the clarification.
Okay. So the other thing that's important is, as we're moving into these hybrid cloud environments, we also have to realize how much do you need to care about some of that infrastructure that's out there. And really the focus needs to stay on what you're managing versus what the vendor is managing. And that really comes into play when you're talking about the availability versus the fault versus the performance. As you kind of move up this across this screen, when you're talking about the hybrid environment that is still your on-premise data center where you manage everything, then yes, you care about availability, you care about faults, you care about performance, because you're responsible for all aspects of that model. But then as you start moving into the infrastructure as a service and the platform as a service, the performance and the fault pieces, that becomes a little less important. Availability, yeah, you're still interested in availability. The availability may be more application or service focused, but you're still going to be interested in that. But performance and faults start to become a little less important for the lower level components. They're important for the upper level components in there. You still need to understand performance and fault information for your applications and your services as you move across there, but not so much for the lower level components, because that's being managed by somebody else. That's what you're paying the vendor for, to manage and look at those services. You just need to know essentially, are they up and running? And if you're seeing performance issues on your applications and services, are they the result of something at a lower level that's potentially going on. So we need to point to that potentially. So it's really important to understand where your focus should be for the different services. And as you're going to be in a hybrid model, you're going to have different levels of visibility. So you're not going to be doing fault monitoring across everything, every application in your ecosystem, but for the components that you manage locally in your hybrid environments or at the OS level for your infrastructure as a service, yes, there you still would be concerned with that. So just briefly talking about the OneAgent, everybody should be familiar at some level with what OneAgent does. We know all about the application monitoring, the web server monitoring that it does very well, database, third-party content, all great capabilities, the real and the synthetic user monitoring. But now we start to get into those lower levels that we were talking about that it also provides. So visibility into your different virtual and cloud environments out there, your containerized environment, that host level monitoring that's going to give you that CPU, the memory, disk utilization, network utilization, the process level monitoring within the environment, and the log file monitoring. It's those last 4 to 5 on there that really make up the infrastructure component and network infrastructure component of monitoring within the system. Typically, the point of view from a network and infrastructure monitoring standpoint in classic monitoring was from the external systems that were looking inward at these systems. So that was the polling that people were doing within the system, or watching the network traffic from those choke points on the system, versus Dynatrace is looking at it from a host-centric view, from a OneAgent-centric view. We're still getting the same type of data, but now we're getting it from the hosts themselves that are being connected to and are communicating across your different ecosystems within your hybrid environments that are out there. And of course, the other piece is going to be the plugins to try and get that little extra bit of information that might be key to helping you support and troubleshoot that environment that's out there. The other piece of the Dynatrace architecture is the ActiveGate. It's a very important component that is not licensed, so this is optional, but it is highly recommended that you put this in your different environments, especially from that environment ActiveGate standpoint. If you have specific use cases, it is going to be required. Typically, network security architecture, where you're going to have multiple DMZs out there, where you don't want your OneAgent talking directly to a SaaS cluster out there, and you want to have it function as a proxy. The ability to store memory dumps will require it, or a load distribution of your AWS monitoring, collecting external logs. If you want to be able to run synthetic tests on your internal ecosystem, so you have some internal facing websites where you want to be able to do synthetic testing, whether it's just straight HTTP checks or full browser click paths. You need to use an ActiveGate for that. And then monitoring your various cloud ecosystems and your virtualized infrastructure. You do need an ActiveGate for that. And the piece that we're going to focus on in this is going to be running the plugins from there to get that data from the systems that you cannot install a OneAgent on within the environment. So with that, I'd like to just do a brief demo of one typical example of the type of view we can utilize to get infrastructure data. Any questions that have come up, Andy, before I jump into this?
Yeah, first of all, a lot of great kudos to you. Great explanation earlier on the pinging. There were some questions around capacity planning and predictive analysis. So whether Dynatrace is not only able to monitor the current state, but also give some kind of future outlook, especially interesting for capacity planning. When do we believe a certain resource is running out of capacity? And the answer that I gave, I know in our time series API right now, there's a flag that is called predict, which allows you through the API on individual metrics to get a prediction into the near-term future. And based on what I know, I think there's definitely talks about it, but I'm not sure if there's anything else I can share about it, or if you have any other thoughts on that, on predictive analysis.
No, that would have been the my answer as well on that. I know that there is some work on that. Typically, what we're doing when we're doing the capacity analysis is focusing on the underutilization of the system, because there's too many people that are over provisioning in their environments, and so we can immediately bring to the table those time series views that are going to show when you've put just too many resources out on some of your systems out there, and that brings you some consolidation options in the environment as you're starting to migrate. But there are definitely some work being done to provide some better views into some predictive analytics. But beyond what you mentioned, I think that's the best answer right now.
Mm-hmm. And then also, thanks to Stefan, he gave a great comment on your ICMP description. He said, this is also one of the reasons why AWS has no ping / ICMP on Lightsail and other services, right? Based on what you said earlier, because things are blocked and it doesn't make sense. And then a last comment I want to highlight from Jeff was saying, what about real user monitoring? Shouldn't that also be always in the client's responsibility? And what I answered is, clearly, real user monitoring and real user performance is very important, but the focus of today's performance clinic is on system monitoring, on infrastructure monitoring. And if there is anybody that is interested in our real user monitoring capabilities, please check out the other performance clinics we've done in the recent past on real user monitoring.
Absolutely, and that was one of the earlier slides showing the Dynatrace capabilities with both the infrastructure, full stack, and DEM. We always consider the client-side monitoring to be a critical component of anything that's out there. But as you said, the focus of this is primarily on the lower parts of the stack. But absolutely, RUM will always be something we want to do by default whenever possible. So this is, don't take this as being, this is your typical out-of-the-box view that you're going to get. This is one of our new templates that we have. We're trying out a variety of different views out there. This is just one example of a potential way of managing an infrastructure portal with some various dashboards. I don't know, in my opinion, if I would use this as like a typical NOC view that's out there. I think a NOC should be looking more at availability and problems than looking at real-time performance type statistics that are on there. But this is the type of dashboard that I would potentially use for doing troubleshooting with an environment. If you've had problems, notifications occur stating that there's an issue with a particular host or a particular system within your environment, and you need to do a little more detailed view of it. A typical one would be there's network problems. Okay, well, if you're not looking at all of the switches and the routers out there, how can you isolate where that potential network problem is within the environment? So I would use something like a view similar to this potentially for doing the troubleshooting. Right now, what's critical though is make judicious use of your, and apologies for the pop-ups, make judicious use of your management zones, because if you're looking at this at a high level that's aggregated across your entire tenant, you're generally going to miss a few things that are in there. So keep it tied to the specific management zones where you are interested in or you have responsibility for, even if that means potentially having a couple of different tiles. Right now, this one is a high level that will look at everything, but you can also tie specific tiles to specific management zones as well. And I'll show in one of my other dashboards that I threw together yesterday how we would do that specifically. So in this case, we would look at things like your retransmissions is something that I'm worried about out there. That's a network-based issue, but I need to be able to isolate when there are where within the network this potentially is occurring. So I would want to drill into that particular chart and see which one of these services that I'm looking at is running, or one of these processes is seeing a lot of retransmissions, and I would drill into that, and then from there go into into the process connections. This is where you're going to get that breakdown of where the different processes are communicating to and what the different levels of retransmissions are. You're going to be able to see discretely which ones are the ones that are having the problems with retransmissions. So even though we're not doing this as a automated root cause analysis to tell you that there's a particular network path that is having problems, this is giving you the information necessary to isolate potentially where there are some issues going on. So we can see in this case, we've got higher retransmissions showing up on this particular connection that's going out there, which we would then be able to go in a little bit further and see what services that's working with, and see if there might be some particular metrics and log entries that could be causing problems. That could be the source of the issues there, and we can then furthermore look at the process connections coming out of that particular system and see, again, is it isolated to just this connection, in which case we're able to talk to the network team or the people that own responsibility for that path and for the devices within that path, and say you've got some drops occurring within this path, and we can see what other applications and services might be also affected potentially by that. So it's really a case of just doing some quick fault domain isolation, because we're seeing all of this data based from that host-centric view. So all of the different hosts and processes, we're able to see the discrete metrics around the network performance out there within the system. So even without having that visibility into the lower level of the network transport that's out there, we're able to do some very good fault domain isolation to quickly see where there might be some particular issues. And then that's where we can start using some of the other capabilities to potentially start going in a little bit deeper into what might be out there. And I'll talk about that as we go further within the system. Okay, any questions before we go a little bit further in terms of some of the infrastructure monitoring?
Nothing new that just came in.
Okay.
Yeah, nothing new.
Okay, so one of the big questions when you talk about network monitoring is, well, what about the packets? Packets are still going to be out there, and they're still going to be useful in some particular use cases. The primary use cases classically have been for general network performance monitoring, for monitoring of your wide area networks that are out there, for end user performance for some of your non-web-based applications. So that includes bespoke apps like SAP and Citrix, and then multimedia. If you want to know what your MOS scores are and see why you've got so much, why your video is so choppy for your internal video conferencing, packets are a good way to do that. But it's also becoming more and more the area for network forensics. It has been for a while, and this is really now the primary focus from a packet standpoint. It's security. And that's really where the primary focus from a network for packet and flow data is. And there's a number of reasons for that. It's becoming really a lot more difficult to implement those outside of the edge of your on-prem data centers because of the way application architectures are. Yes, there are potential options for trying to set up virtual taps in some of your cloud ecosystems, but that's really a very tough thing to do because of the dynamic nature of it, and because of the fact that a lot of the cloud providers really don't like you pulling packets from there when there potentially might be other shared data going on some of those same paths that are out there. And realistically, if you're able to get a OneAgent on those, if you manage a host at an OS level, which is the minimum level that would be necessary to really be able to put a virtual tap into that environment, then why not just put the OneAgent out there and be able to see that same level of data? The other thing is that with all the software-defined networks that are out there and the SD-WANs that we're seeing, the architecture, even in those on-prem environments, are becoming really dynamic, and it's a lot tougher to capture those packets out there. And if you want data about how some of that is performing, use the APIs. A lot of the SD-WAN controllers out there are going to have rich APIs that you can pull a lot of metrics in from the system out there. And this is probably the one that is becoming most critical at this point. The newer encryption ciphers, as everybody's finally moving to ephemeral and Diffie-Hellman, and it's becoming the default with TLS 1.2 and 1.3 out there, it's becoming invisible to us. You're able to see high-level information, but you're not able to decrypt those packets anymore. So the result is you're just going to see high-level metrics anyways. So the wire data for performance and fault information is really becoming less and less useful at this point because they're just specific corner cases. It's really all about the security at this point. That's really the primary use case for that. And those higher-level utilization metrics that you can get even on the encrypted data out there, a lot of that can be pulled in from things like SNMP anyways. So why spend all the money trying to put these taps out here and trying to follow the packets at this point? Yes, there will always be a need for those tactical troubleshooting where you're going to quickly throw a span up someplace and get your laptop out and run a Wireshark capture, but those are definitely the corner cases. Those are the exceptions to the rule out there. But we still have a need to get some data out of those systems that OneAgent cannot be installed on, which in a lot of cases may have been your network type devices where traffic is flowing through them. And previously that was the domain of packet level data, because you would have be capturing packets in front and behind of some of these systems that were out there, or you would be decoding transactions for some of these particular use systems that are out there. But now with the Dynatrace extensions, that's where we can take things like your load balancers, like your proxy servers, like your firewalls, where you see those TCP terminations occurring on the connections, and we're able to bring those in with our extensions and our plugins. So we have services that will have been created automatically by OneAgent being installed out there on the different applications. But now we're also going to have an ActiveGate plugin that's going to create a custom device that will be represented in our Smartscape, because we see that the conversation will go through, say, for instance, an F5 within that environment. And then that allows us to utilize the data that we're coming in automatically with Davis, so that we can see a problem on a service level was going on out there. We saw that there was a deployment event, and then we can see that some of this data, here's where the specific root cause is. So this is allowing us to utilize Davis from an automated standpoint. That's a key thing when you're understanding what data you want to bring in. Is it going to be useful to Davis? Are we going to be getting good problem cards out of this? Is it relevant data? And that's something we'll go into as we go on. So before we talk a little bit more about some of the specifics of the extensions, I want to talk about synthetics for availability from the standpoint of network monitoring and infrastructure monitoring. And the reason I'm talking about this from an extension standpoint, just finishing up that initial part of the discussion, is that there's two ways that you can look at doing synthetics for availability. Right now, a lot of infrastructure components out there have web UIs for doing their administration interface. So you can just go into our base synthetics functionality and utilize an HTTP check against the admin interface for the system. That's a perfectly valid method of doing it. That will give you some good information, but in many cases, the admins for your systems may not like you doing availability checks against them, or it may use up a little bit of excess resources on there. But it is typically a good canary in a coal mine of a problem occurring on a system, because if an admin interface for an infrastructure component is not available, that's typically one of the first warning signs that that system is in some level of distress. But there's a better way to do that that's a little broader, and that is through utilizing our synthetic API to be able to bring in tests into our synthetic system. So one of the ones we have out there right now is a port check, because in many cases there won't be a web interface available for that, but you can go in through Telnet, or more likely through a PuTTY session, through SSH. So there will be ports that are open and will respond, or it could be a service port that's open that you're looking to just do a quick TCP port check on to see, is the database listener open and available on there? Maybe it's working on the web service is working on a different port, and you want to just run a quick check against that. This gives you a little more flexibility utilizing the port check from this standpoint. And setting it up is a very straightforward process in there. So it's going to be done through an extension. You're going to create that extension first on there. If we go into your system, you're going to go to monitored technologies, custom extensions. You're going to load the extension first onto your ActiveGate in the environment, and they can be typically those Windows ActiveGates for some of those types of extensions. And then once you've done that, you're going to upload it to the Dynatrace instance, and then you're going to be able to configure it. This is where you will go in and you will add your different endpoints into the system on there. If I want to add a new endpoint, it's going to be just putting in the name, the IP address, or the FQDN of the system, and whatever the port is. Again, I could do this as an HTTP check essentially and just put port 80 in here, and it would be the same functionality, but now I've got the flexibility to go in and do it port 22 or port 23 or 1521 if I'm looking for a database, any number of different ones out there. You'll already have an API token that was created to allow you to import those tests, and you're going to select the ActiveGate that you're utilizing. And once I have done that, then I'm going to have that set up. It will verify that it can connect to it, and you're done. And now you've got the additional endpoints. An important thing to understand is there's two ways to add endpoints into your different extensions that you have out there. You can do it manually with just some quick cut and paste, but you can also utilize our API to upload multiple endpoints. Typically, it's faster if you've got less single-digit number of endpoints to add to do that via the UI. But if you're going to be adding in 40, 50 potential endpoints or more out there, I definitely think about doing it via the API. That's going to give you the better method. And even though this is an extension, we've now imported this in, and if I go into my synthetic tests, you'll see that I now have my synthetic tests showing in there as synthetic monitors. There are port test types that are in there, and I can go in and look at individual ones out there within the environment to be able to see how they were running, and more importantly, were there any problems? So I will be able to see immediately if there were any failures, and I can tune those individual tests and the failures out there accordingly. The other important note is I want to be tagging these as well, because I'm going to have a lot of different port checks out there. These tags are what are going to allow me to differentiate what part of the ecosystem that these tests are part of. And I mentioned earlier when we were looking at that high-level infrastructure dashboard, how it's important to differentiate with your different management zones, some different parts of the dashboard so that it looks a little bit cleaner. If we look at what one that's a little better set up and better differentiated, we're going to have the different ecosystems out here with my synthetic monitoring. This is a lot less busy out here. This would be something more that a NOC could use. And again, I set this up in about 5-10 minutes. So this is quick and easy to do. But each of these can represent synthetic tests in a different DMZ based on what I've tagged out there. So I can have some that are looking at my external DMZ systems, seeing that my firewall, my proxy, my global load balancers, my routers, concentrators are all available. And are there any problems related to any of these DMZ systems that are out there, and then potentially looking a little more inside of my hybrid environment. Now I'm on-prem. I might be looking at my WAN accelerators, my VoIP systems, my VoIP servers are always going to be important, especially now that everybody's using soft phones. If they're not doing voice calls via externally hosted Skype, they may still be using via soft phones or Cisco soft phones or somebody else. And the call servers are going to be on-prem, and that's something that you're going to be monitoring out there. Citrix systems are going to be critical right now with the present environment, because you've got so many people that are connecting via remote workforces. So those VDI systems, the provisioning systems, you need to understand the availability of those, start looking at those from an infrastructure standpoint out there within the environment. And are there any problems? And if there were problems, in particular with any of these, I can drill in, and it'll take me immediately to the test, and I can go see if there was a problem with a particular one. So quick and easy to set up that type of view. I would probably, this one is very focused around infrastructure availability. We could create a higher level dashboard also that mixed and match. So you would have OneAgent data where available also in here, showing some performance and fault metrics potentially, along with the availability information. That would be the good mix for the NOC, or at the very least, if we looked back at the original infrastructure view, we could set up hyperlinks that would take us in. So we'd have an availability link that could take us to that. So you might have some nested dashboards within your different environment that you have out there. But either way, it's giving you a really quick at-a-glance view of, is everything available that is relevant in my environment, and are there problems out there? So any questions before we go a little bit further into that?
Yeah, there's one question. So the port extension that you just shown, the question is, how do people get this port extension? Can you show this again, or can you explain?
That's an excellent question, and I will cover that in a moment with the as we go a little bit deeper into the extensions.
Okay, perfect. That was the only one that just came in.
Okay. Oh, talking about ActiveGate extensions within the environment. Again, these are things that you can write yourself. So again, we've got a developer kit for that you can see through the documentation. And we also have several turnkey extensions that have been written that are, we have a dedicated extensions team that has written these, and these are officially licensable and supportable. They will consume custom metrics, and there will, so that is something you need to take into account when you're bringing in this data. There will be individual time series for them, but these are all available right now as of May 2020. Then you have some of the custom ones which have been field written. Potentially, that can include the port check out there. That can include DNS. That can include things like SNMP polling, which I'll get into in 1 second. It's just check with your sales team on how to get that. If you want this to be supported, that does require, meaning it's going to be tuned and supported officially by our extensions team. That does require a service engagement. But in terms of usage out there, just talk to your sales team, and they can see about getting access potentially to some of those additional ones that are out there, including the port check.
So Mike, one question that just came in on the turnkey solutions. Do these extensions consume custom metric licensing?
Yes, they do. And again, you can check with your sales team on that. Sales engineers like myself will have a calculator, essentially, where we will ask you specific questions depending on what the system is. So it would be for an F5, for instance, we're going to be looking at how many VIPs do you want to monitor out there, looking at the number of reels that you have out there, looking at the number of I rules, and we can calculate the number of custom custom metrics that would consume. For each of the different platforms out there, we have specific calculations that will help you determine how many custom metrics. The general rule of thumb is if you're doing full monitoring for any given platform out there, expect that it's going to use somewhere between 80 to about 120 custom metrics on average. That can go up if you basically turn on every single bell and whistle and pull in every single metric, no matter how arcane. But typically, from a planning standpoint, we tell people somewhere in the 100 range is just a good judge out there.
Perfect. But I think it's great to know that you have a calculator. So for any of these extensions, just talk with the sales team, and then they can give you access or walk with you through that calculator. That's good to know.
Yes, we will walk through you with the calculator, because as the extensions are updated, we do change that calculator. So that's why we like to make sure that we've always got the most updated one out there. SNMP monitoring and how we do that presently within the environment. And it turns out that Mr. Grabner did have a nice little webinar on this a few months back, where this specific topic came up in terms of the custom plugins. This is still available on Dynatrace University, and this is another example of, if you need SNMP data right now at this time, this would be a way of doing it. Again, to make this supportable in your environment, it really would be necessary to do this as a service engagement, so that it can be properly tuned for your environment and for what your particular use case is. But it is something that is viable at this time. But this is also something that wasn't necessarily designed to scale to a large level, and so we want to improve this, and that's where our future capabilities come into play on this. And so what we will have in the not too distant future, and we are just going to say coming soon, there's no definitive dates on this, is these extensions will be available through the Dynatrace store. This is something that was introduced and shown at Perform, and this is something that will be appearing in the not too distant future. So you'll have the ability to pull in different types of extensions. There may be a generic SNMP extension. It could be one that is platform specific, like for your routers or for your firewalls or your load balancers out there within the environment. But this will allow you to add that in, and then it will help you with the configuration of that, including, again, adding all of the devices on there, what specific metrics you're going to want, and also that's where we're going to start thinking about trap collection, which again is going to be critical when it comes to that fault monitoring in the environment, is being able to pull those traps out there. And then you'll be able to display that data up on the dashboards, just like anything else within the environment out there. So it may be just generic metrics that we're pulling in on that, but this is where you're going to see some of that information again. And this is also going to be potentially raising those problem cards out there within the environment. So this is all stuff that is coming soon. If we have specific questions around that, that's why we have our wonderful product manager on board to discuss this. But Dynatrace is definitely going down this path, and this is something that we will be addressing at a larger scale. And I just wanted to stop there and see if there were any questions, since I know that's why we have Matthias here. I think we're good then.
Sorry, I said there is no additional questions that came in so far, but sometimes people take a couple of minutes to type it in. So I'm sure there will be more questions in the official Q&A later on.
Okay. Now, talking about extending Dynatrace a little further when it comes to these extensions out there. So if we start thinking about some of these other types of infrastructure devices that you have out there. So your layer 2 and your layer 3 switches that you have out there, the WAN routers. Yes, we're thinking about those, but the question is, what do you need to do with that? SAN attached storage is a very common one that comes out there. WAN accelerators, DNS appliances. A lot of people are going to be running their Infoblocks out there that manages all of their internal DNS and DHCP, and they want visibility into that, or just OS hosts that are not supported out there within the system. And up until COVID-19 reared its head, video conferencing systems were always a hot topic for monitoring out there. Theoretically, any of these we could do. They have APIs, or they have SNMP level data, or there's any number of ways to potentially get data out of there. And yes, we could write extensions for them. But the question is, what would Davis do with it? I mean, is it going to be valuable data, valuable metrics that you're going to get out of it? If you're just looking for basic availability out of those, great. We can do that already with some of these checks that we talked about from an availability standpoint with those synthetic checks. So that's not necessary to write a full extension for that. But if you're looking for fault level data, that's when the SNMP trap functionality comes. That can definitely provide some of that, or logging. Potentially can provide some of that. But for the full extension, we really need to ask ourselves if it's necessary and if it's worthwhile. And that's why I like to go back to this old famous quote from that wonderful fictional mathematician, Ian Malcolm, of if their scientists are so preoccupied with whether they could do it, they didn't stop to think if they should. And that's really what we need to look at. We could model and set up extensions to pull in data from every single infrastructure component in your environment. I mean, technically, that is doable. Most everything is going to have some sort of interface to be able to pull data out. But the question is, should you? Do you really need it at that point? And that really brings us into the best practices recommendations that we have from this standpoint. So when you're looking at a lot of your typical NOCs out there, yes, maybe there are some infrastructure monitoring solutions that can give you that single pane of glass where you're going to have a bazillion little LEDs on it, and it's going to be spaghetti on glass. You're basically taking 500,000 different metrics and condensing them all down into one screen. Well, that's nice, but that's really still not going to give you a lot of what you need. You need something that's more problem-oriented and more focus-oriented about specific use cases. So it's really about keeping the smartscape and your dashboards clean out there. And you really want to focus on the events, not the metrics. Dynatrace is really all about problem resolution when it comes to your infrastructure that's out there. So that should be your primary goal, not really just creating all these nice charts for some of these infrastructure metrics. The majority of your infrastructure metrics out there are going to be extraneous when it comes to troubleshooting in your environment. A CPU went to 100% on a top of rack switch out there. Okay. Did that impact anybody? Did that cause any of your services to go down in the environment? Maybe, maybe not. Do I need to be charting my CPU utilization for all of my top of rack switches out there on a main dashboard that somebody in a NOC is looking at 24/7? Probably not. You really just need to be utilizing Davis and the fault domain isolation techniques we talk about to get to the answer from a troubleshooting standpoint. But that's not to say that those metrics aren't going to be interesting to the right audience that's out there. One of the very common asks that I get with a lot of our proofs of concept that we do, and even following on with customers as they're implementing their systems, are they have a business teams that are going to be asking for detailed infrastructure performance information. And, well, why does a CTO need to see what CPU utilization is of their web servers and the Nginx box out there? I mean, they shouldn't be caring about that. There are going to be teams that need that level of detail out there, but not Everybody needs that. So don't provide all of these extraneous reports and data to teams that don't need them. They're going to end up with data overload, and as a result, they're going to be ignoring a lot of what you're sending them in the past. So keep it relevant, keep it tight, keep it clean from that standpoint. Let the AI, let Davis do all the work for you. Let it do the analytics. Bubble up the important information only on there. It doesn't matter if we can put 5,000 metrics on a single dashboard out there, because probably 4,990 of those are going to be irrelevant most of the time. It's only really during certain troubleshooting that you need to drill down into those metrics potentially. And yes, we'll be able to do that with you. So lastly, I wanted to just bring up one additional use case that has come up in the last week or so that we didn't cover when it comes to infrastructure monitoring. That's going to start to become a lot more common out there, and that's when it comes to SecOps. The security teams are something that traditionally we haven't worked with much in the past, other than just making sure that they're okay with Dynatrace being installed in their environments. But as it turns out, more and more, they're starting to leverage that data that's out there within the environment. And we had a recent blog published by another one of our really great sales engineers, Willie Hicks, who works out of the federal space, talking specifically about some of his recent experiences with working with the DevSecOps teams out there, and how that visibility into the Smartscape, that ability to see when new processes are spinning up on an environment out there within your different parts of your ecosystems out there. And as we showed before, that ability to see where there might be some anomalous connections and communications going on within the environment out there. That visibility is something that your SecOps teams are also going to want to potentially leverage out there, because we're giving you deep visibility into those ecosystems that they may not necessarily have. They may understand some of the silos that are out there in terms of anomalous behavior, but we're giving you that full picture with everything that we have now and this is not just at the service level, this is at the infrastructure, at that process and host level that we have out there. So that's an additional use case that is now starting to crop up, and Dynatrace is well placed to help your teams address that. And with that, I'd like to go ahead and see if there are any other questions as we wrap up.
Yeah, so thank you so much, first of all. The question that just came in, how about sizing? How about sizing your ActiveGate environments in case you do really large-scale monitoring of external systems that are not handled by the OneAgent? Are there any guidelines? Is there anybody to reach out to? How would that work?
Yeah, definitely reach out to your sales team at a minimum, and in many cases we're going to work with this. If you've got a very large scale environment, that's where the services team our architects can help you with making sure that you've right-sized your environment and are deploying your ActiveGates in an optimal manner out there. Generally, if you're going to have an environment with a couple hundred different endpoints that you're monitoring and a couple of different DMZs, then just the documented levels that we guidelines that we have are sufficient. But if you're talking about thousands of endpoints out there across dozens of different sites and numerous different DMZs, then definitely engage your sales team, and they will, as necessary, bring in the services team as well to help make sure that you are right-sized. We have deployed this into very large enterprises, into their hybrid clouds, and so it definitely does scale, but you do want to make sure that going in, your design is right for doing that deployment, and we can assist you with that.
Perfect. So if there's any, we're out of time. We actually ran a couple of minutes over, but it seems most of people really stayed because it was a really interesting topic. Thank you so much, Mike. Also, Maciej, I know you're also back in behind the scenes. If any further questions come up, folks, if you're listening now or if you watch this at a later time, please reach out to your Dynatrace team. Also make sure you are pointing people to the places where they can get more information about Dynatrace. The recording of this episode will be uploaded to Dynatrace University as well as at the YouTube channel. You can always reach out to everyone at Dynatrace through answers.dynatrace.com if you have questions. And yeah, Mike, I know that you are obviously in touch a lot with customers around this. If your name is out there, maybe, people will probably try to reach out to you directly as well. But if you have questions, just let us know. And Mike, again, thank you so much. I want to have you back at a later point in time with updates, especially, I know SNMP, you just covered it briefly. Once we get more clarity and we're getting closer to the release date, I'm sure this will be a great moment to cover this in its entirety.
Absolutely. Thank you, Andy, for the opportunity, and thanks everybody for your time today.
All right. Bye-bye. Stay safe and healthy.